Hello, everyone. Welcome to the MakerDAO Scientific Governance and Risk Meeting number 112, taking place on Thursday, October the 1st, 1600 UTC, same time every week. My name's Long for Wisdom. I'm the MakerDAO Governance Facilitator, for those that don't know. We've got an agenda, so I'll kind of go through that in a little bit. So let's go through the kind of general rules of the meeting. Anyone's free to interrupt and kind of make comments if they want to. So feel free to do that. If it becomes like a problem, I'll move things on. So yeah, I guess let's get started. All right, agenda for today. So we have the weekly updates from the various domains and on some other bits. We're going to have the governance cycle review for the September governance cycle. We're going to have a segment on badges from community development. I'm not actually sure who's presenting that, but I'm sure they'll tell me before it starts. We're going to have a brief segment on the rate setting v2 from Sam M, also known as Hexanaut. And then we're going to have State of the Peg later as well. And then we'll probably have some time for discussion and QA as usual. All right, so I'll kick off the weekly updates with governance at a glance, I think. So looking over the forums this week, been a couple of good discussions, a couple of good signals. So let's see, so we've had a discussion that's been going on for a couple of weeks from Derek that's kind of had some new discussion on it. Derek provided an update on using snapshot to improve signaling and polls, which prompted a little bit of discussion. See, we had a thread about kind of theorizing around the legal structures of MakerDAO from SubVentures, kind of discussing some of the various legal structures that could be put in place to kind of manage a DAO. And then we also had a informal poll and some kind of discussion around what rate setting version 2 will look like from Hexanaut. So there's been some discussions in terms of seeking consensus for signal requests. We've had one from Aaron Barsh for increasing the auction surplus, so the auction surplus buffer or the system surplus buffer. So this is the buffer that accrues DAI from stability fees. So that's kind of, had a fair level discussion, given that it controls whether we start burning Maker or whether we delay burning Maker or whether we burn some Maker and then stop again later on as we increase the buffer. Aaron's also proposed a ETHB vault collateral type, kind of trying to crowdsource some of the initial parameters using forum polls, kind of after Promish's and the rate and the risk team's kind of presentation on ETHB. And then there's a full signal request up for the rates v2 proposal from Hexanauts, which talks about, kind of goes into details of what we're kind of proposing for rates v2, and figuring out how to kind of manage setting rates on all these vault types going forwards. So yeah, I think that pretty much covers governance at a glance. I'll put the link in the chat if anyone wants to look in more detail. But yeah, I think we can. Actually, I guess other governance updates. I'm planning to make some minor changes to the forum probably next week in terms of just switching categories around a little bit to kind of hopefully make it easier to read and kind of keep track of what's going on. So keep a lookout for that. It shouldn't be like, it's not going to be any like sort of groundbreaking changes. It should just be like cleaning up some of the old categories that don't work and maybe adding a couple for like signal requests and for some stuff that could potentially be separated from governance, because that category is getting kind of big. All right, I think that covers me. So I guess let's go through the rest of the weekly updates. Smart contracts, have you guys got anything to share?
Sure. Hey everybody, this is Chris Mooney with Smart Contracts Domain Team. So last week we worked on the domain team work for collateral onboarding for like the priority sheet. So there's a bunch of work happening across all of the sort of domain teams right now to come up with a priority sheet for collaterals, and we're all sort of refining that. So we're optimistic. I think maybe next week we'll have like a pretty good priority sheet for how we take all these green lights and turn it into something. We did a full review of MIP 21, which is one of the real world asset additions. So it would be a real world asset type. It's a technical MIP. And we've looked over that and think it's ready for voting. So please, when you see that, consider approving it. And we did the same thing for MIP 20, which is the Vox. So we've reviewed that code and that MIP. And I'll just emphasize that I think that the Vox is really just a tool, a governance tool that we could use. We don't need to actually turn it on yet, but it's nice to have, it's nice to hedge our bets if like peg management doesn't work out for us. So yeah, so please consider that. And then for the monthly spell, on Monday, we got comp, loop ring, and link added as collateral types. And I think they're everywhere. I don't recall if they're actually in Oasis yet, but I think like auctions, everything is firing for them. So so all of those are up. So if you guys want to create positions on those, feel free. We also reviewed the new TUSD adapter implementation. So there's a fix in the TUSD adapter implementation that re-enables their like legacy ERC20 token. And so that's that looks good. And I think that we're going to try and get that into this Friday's executive for approval. And yeah, and so there was also some sort of internal work on creating a lot of documentation around collateral onboarding with an eye towards, you know, possibly having collateral onboarding teams in the future. So more to come on that. In the coming week, more work on what I just mentioned, the collateral onboarding team stuff. And then we have a whole new list of collateral types. And so we're thinking sort of tentatively, I know we're probably gonna, you know, break the MIP structure a little bit or put it on temporary hiatus while we like have more adaptability to onboard collateral. But right now, I think the domain teams are tentatively thinking of doing Lend, PaxG, Wi-Fi, BAL, Uni, Ren BTC, possibly TTC, and GUSD in the sort of coming month. And maybe we'll be able to do that more in a weekly cycle if we get there. There's some tooling happening around executives to make them a little bit easier to write. That sort of goes with the collateral onboarding documentation. And then slated on my list or our list is to review the final review of the Flashmint module and the MIP that was submitted by Sam M for Flash minting DAI. And that's it for the smart contracts domain. If anyone has a question.
Chris, just to clarify, when you say the Vox and the RWA are ready for voting, we did identify that there might be some things that need to get changed in the real world assets adapter just to integrate appropriately with our new liquidation system. So the code, I wouldn't say is ready there. It just needs some updates. I think the Vox is ready to go. So just, I want to clarify that people aren't voting for the code as is.
Yeah, that's actually a good procedural, because this was a little bit of a question mark as well. So when we approve a technical MIP, I like to think of it as like sort of ratifying a request for comment or something. It's nice to have some prototype code. It's nice to sort of really think through and see if it's going to work. But there's still a whole host of sort of checklists that we need to go through in order to craft, like actually build an executive and deploy it. And that includes a lot of the security roadmap, possibly formal verification, audits, a bug bounty, you know, more extensive code review, the crafting of all the deployment spells. I mean, there's still a lot of stuff that happens. So really, you know, if you sort of ratify the technical MIP, I think there's still sort of one more step, which is the technical implementation, which would eventually find its way into an executive. So, those are mostly locked down, but there's still a few changes. Like we PR'd something today to the to MIP 21. So.
Cool. Thanks, guys.
Yep.
One thing I probably should have mentioned in my updates was that with the conclusion of the September MIP cycle, Chris and Brian and Lucas and Will are all officially ratified as smart contracts domain team members, which is cool, as is pretty much as a risk team member. So, you know, congratulations to them all for meeting everyone's approval, I guess. Cool. Yeah, sorry, left. Yes.
Charles, could you clarify the point you just made in the comment about iterating on the code after the proposal has been accepted, but not while it's being voted on? So can you maybe explain like when is a good time to incorporate changes in the code, and what is the process to follow?
Well, I'm keen to get everyone else's perspective on this, but the main reason that I said that was because if the solution in the future needs to be improved or, well, iterated on in any capacity, you can do so after it's been voted on. But if it's changing while the vote is happening, there's potential for sneaking in some things that people might not notice. But the idea is that if something needs to change in the future, you can make that change. It's just not while being voted on. So like, for example, the liquidations 1.1 and 1.2 have been improvements. So you might have to have a follow-up proposal to incorporate these changes, but I think we should have an open discussion about that and how the technical process could work.
Yeah, I think that's reasonable, that we don't have a moving target while it's being voted on. Could you also clarify, I'm wondering, like, is there a process for this kind of last mile when something goes into an executive? Like, for example, does the executive spell actually, is there a stage where the executive spell is actually let's say audited by a domain team or something like that? Or like, how does the stage after like proposal acceptance to obviously the executive spell, what ratifies the executive spell is the actual voting on the executive spell, but is there like a governance stage prior to that?
Yeah, so I can let Chris and Brian and the rest of the domain team answer the more technical details of it, but once the week 3 governance poll approves the MIPs, the domain team begins to work on creating the technical implementation for the spell for the executive vote on the following Monday. But maybe, yeah, Chris or Ryan could talk more about the actual steps.
Yeah, so I can say, sort of internally, whenever we are building an executive spell, there's a kind of laundry list of things that need to go through, and it's just an enormous amount of code review and integration testing and whatnot. And so, and then ultimately all of that's going to culminate in putting it on like some sort of approval list so that it's viewable in the voting portal. So I think if let's say Lev, you were going to work on one of these executive spells and hand it off to us, we would put it through the same ringer that we would if any one of us wrote it individually. So so it would probably end up going through that process. I don't know if there's like a formal MIP process around that yet. Maybe we'll need one, maybe we don't. But yeah, I don't know if that answers more of your question there.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And also what Charles said was also seemed reasonable. I'm just wondering, so is it a fair approximation to say that basically once the proposal has been accepted, then the stage between that and the spell being executed is basically, as a reference, we can imagine it's the same process as for any spell that's currently being proposed and executed. Like basically the domain team is either preparing it or reviewing it if someone else has proposed it, and basically on their own schedule and on their to the same standard. And then once that's done, only then it's proposed as an executive.
I think that makes the most sense. But yeah, go on. Whoever else is going to.
I was asked, so I joined a little bit late, but I had a question about just these MIP 21 and MIP 22 are proposing code, but they don't foresee a specific executive spell to be deployed. They're just sort of general purpose frameworks, right? So I think this is not described in the MIP process, but how would so what is the process from going from like, okay, the general code has been accepted to someone still needs to write a spell and then deploy it. And is that then another MIP proposal, or how would that sort of go into the?
I think that's exactly what we were talking about. And also for context, like MIP 20 doesn't have an executive spell either. And I think, in fact, there isn't precedent for MIPs coming with an executive spell, in particular because the executive spell might have to be tailored to the state of the system at the time when it's
I would strongly
you can't go through a process for it. And lastly, it would be kind of absurd to actually have to ratify an executive spell and then execute it, because the way that it's executed is through a vote. So my understanding is that basically once it goes through the MIPS process, it falls into the same funnel as any other executive spell, which we're not having special. We don't have a special multi-week process for accepting those as a community.
Yeah, I would strongly suggest we don't really create a MIP process around the executive spell, just because there's so much tooling and dynamic coding that happens around that. The process is changing frequently. We're updating it to be more secure constantly. It would just be really, really hard. That one process alone would take like just so much MIP work. We're probably much better off to, once it's ratified, to just sort of work with the smart contracts domain team to start to craft a spell. And I think that's the right path forward. If anyone objects, let me know, but that's my guess.
I'll maybe talk about this a little bit. So I think the original plan when technical MIPs were kind of envisioned was that like all of the code, including like the spell code, would be completed before the MIP was even proposed, right? And then the MIP was proposed, and then when the MIP got to the final stage and was ready for executive vote, all of that code would just be included in like that final executive spell. In practice, like I don't think this really works out super well for the reasons you guys have just described. So yeah, I think we're kind of like, as long as it doesn't become a problem where like something gets ratified and then for whatever reason it just doesn't get implemented for ages, like that's potentially a problem, because if it's been ratified but then never happens. But so far, like we haven't seen any issues with that, right? So I think we can just, if that problem starts coming up, then we can start looking at, building a process that kind of prevents that from happening, right?
So
yeah,
then,
to be fair, like we're updating our process for creating the spells, and we're also, there's behind the scenes some things going on with the governance itself, for changing the way that votes get processed. So any spell that's created now might not work with the new process. So
yeah.
what does that mean? So what's the best way forward with like the MIP 22 then, where I think we're like, I guess at a similar spot than with MIP 21.
So is MIP, that wasn't on my radar. So did MIP 22 get proposed for this cycle?
I mean, it's been in sort of the RFC phase for a month, and before that discussion was about to happen, we were considering whether we want to propose it or not. And I think the deadline for that is today, if I'm correct.
So the deadline is actually, the deadline's next Monday to Wednesday to formally submit it. But in this last week, it's the frozen period, so you can't make any more changes as kind of a way for the community to look at the final state of it and make sure you don't make any last minute changes before it goes up for votes for security reasons. But if it has been in RFC for a month, yeah, you can definitely go ahead and propose it. But if you want to continue doing RFC for another month or another 6 months, it's totally up to you as the author of the proposal. I
mean, the challenge is there wasn't really any feedback from the domain team, smart contracts domain team.
Lucas, why don't I'll put that on our list, so we'll get you in the coming week and review your MIP, and then the same thing. Don't worry about the executive spell for it. We'll review the sort of declaration of intent, the technical MIP, any code that you have with it. Try and get through all of that, and then we'll give it a sort of thumbs up or thumbs down, and we'll push it through the process. And after that, we'll worry about making an executive for it.
Okay. So is that so? Then the question. So there have been like actually today I was working on this with Martin Lundfall a bit, and we've been sort of making improvements that I guess would have to now be added after the frozen period if we plan to submit it. And that's, I guess, what we'll do, or should we just sort of not so formally propose it and just sort of skimp around the process a bit that we have in place?
I mean, it may be a question for Charles. Charles, I pushed a PR to MIP21 today to make the flipper work with liquidations 1.2. So, you know, do we want to be code frozen there?
Let me chime in here. Like, I see very few situations where some code might come in that we wouldn't want to change it, just because, you know, we're the domain experts. We know how this might integrate with the system. We'd probably want to beef up tests around it, and that might discover things. Like, I'm leery of just accepting code as written and submitted.
Yeah, I mean, if, you know, let's say with my PR, for example, right? We could easily vote on this. It's just a, you know, it's obviously a change that's going to happen before we can push it live. That we can certainly PR it after this process is done. I don't, you know, maybe the changes for Martin are the same for Lucas's MIP22. I don't know. Charles, do you have an opinion?
Could you rephrase the question, please? I'm kind of confused. Are you asking that, are you allowed to be a contributor on the code? Or?
No, yeah, it's more just that for both of these MIPs, the code should have been maybe frozen yesterday, according to what you're saying. And yeah. I was wondering how much liberty we have, let's say the domain teams have after, because we're kind of going to give them, you know, a thumbs up or a thumbs down prior to being voted. I would assume no one's probably going to, I guess they could put it in without our thumbs up or thumbs down. But then after that process is complete, rather than just crafting an executive, like we may need to make some changes for security reasons, or, you know, we may end up like engaging in an audit, you know, doing something like that that shows us we need to make a change. Do the domain teams have the liberty to do that? I'm hoping the answer is yes.
I mean, technically it's just like a massive gray area, like so many of our other things. I think it's like fine at this stage, right? Like,
yeah, I agree.
The technical MIP process was kind of written for like this kind of like years in the future where there are like loads of people proposing loads of code changes and they all need to be like super locked down before they're voted on and like confirmed. We're not really there yet, and so like I wouldn't worry about too much for now.
The only thing that I think I would suggest is if changes are being made with respect to anything, be very transparent and open about it, saying we've done this, this is why, so that people are aware, so it doesn't look like things are just snuck in. But yeah, I agree with long proposal 100%.
Right, I think we need to probably move on now because we're half an hour in. Haven't got the oracles update yet. So, but yeah, cheers guys. Nick, do you have any oracles updates this week?
Well, I mean, I guess we can review the stuff that passed in the executive on that we submitted last Friday. So we had a bunch of whitelisting proposals go through. So Kyber got whitelisted on the ETHUSD medianizer. DDEX got whitelisted on the BTC USD medianizer. We had kind of the custom job for Open for the options platform. They were using the V1 oracles that we had deprecated, and they didn't add logic to configure that. So what we did was just wire up the V1 oracles to the V2 stuff. So one would just read from the other. So that passed. We also had Yearn Finance get whitelisted on the BTC USD Oracle for their new BTC kind of delegated vaults that they're cooking up. And I think that's it from the Oracle's front. I don't think there's any new proposals for this week. Yeah, so we're just working on basically the collateral types for October right now.
Great, thanks Nick. Anyone questions before we move on? Looks like no. Primož, do you want to do the risk update?
Yeah, so we're currently putting a lot of effort into developing a new framework for ongoing calculation of risk premiums, debt ceilings, and competitive rates for each world type. So the idea there is to make it less quantitative and more agile, so we can provide these inputs to governance on a more regular basis. And this is also partially related to this new initiative about rate setting, where the risk team will more regularly provide inputs to the so-called rates working group, and I think Sam will talk about it later a bit more. Balancer and why earn collateral evaluations should be released next week. We had to delay a bit evaluations for Aave and PEXG, and they'll probably go through the weekly cycle. So Aave is still in the middle of the migration. We still don't have any information on new tokenomics of Aave. And PEXG will also be the latest set because there are some technical specifics related to ERC20 token contract. As Chris already mentioned, we are working together with other domain teams on new approach for prioritizing collateral that is proposed to be onboarded. So priority will likely be given to those assets which have high potential to generate DAI. But of course, we're also adjusting this list by constraints such as difficulty to add particular collateral and risks associated with it. And then lastly, there's some organizational efforts within the risk domain team. We're defining specialized roles within the team, committing new members, and so far it looks great. We're able to attract some outside members. Yeah, we also created this template for collateral onboarding. So it makes it easier for new members to perform risk evaluations. And that's it from our side.
Okay, yeah, thanks very much. And I guess, yeah, congratulations on becoming a ratified risk domain team.
Thanks.
Cool. So we're going to start having, so I possibly should mention this earlier, we're starting to have community development updates from Amy in as part of this section as well. So Amy, do you want to do your update?
Yeah, cool. Hi, everybody. So there's kind of two roles that I'm working on. One, which is kind of the continued maturity of community development, which we focus on development of community and contributors. So we have a portal launching soon, which are where the resources for a lot of community generated content around like FAQs, how like it can be anything from people who are new to DAI to how governance works, etc. And that will be live very soon. The badges team will give an update, and there is a governance communications team who have been writing the summaries for these calls, as well as introducing this new idea of snippets, which are kind of brief versions of this. And we noticed a lot of people like that as well. So a lot is going on how we improve that governance communication area. Then we do have our development grants as well. We'll be actually introducing a new process, and this is where people in our ecosystem can apply for funding. And so our two newest grantees are SaveDAI and CuraDAI. And then on the people side, we're also looking a lot for obviously more developers always. So we're trying to cultivate programs where we're improving a lot of potential contributors who would be interested in engaging with MakerDAO. And then the second part, mostly what I've been working on recently is around DAO operational work. So focused on bridging kind of a smooth like resource management and distribution from the foundation side as well. So there are a lot of stakeholders to coordinate with. So I just want to like appreciate the patience that people have had and been giving. I will be introducing a new MIP soon, a support domain, where for the October cycle, which would cover, this domain would cover kind of bootstrapping general operations for potential domains that are difficult to scale quickly. So something like HR, legal, we've been working a lot on how we actually can form like can have a legal domain, for example, and what community members would be interested in covering that as well. And then the second piece is around cross-domain coordination. So I think the smart contracts team brought up there's kind of a collateral onboarding documentation and process initiative where we focus on how we make that process smoother and more inclusive of all levels. And then the third piece to the support domain would be grants management and distribution, which is a lot of the work we've been doing. A lot of our community members are also grantees, and then it's kind of a way to onboard a lot of the people who kind of participate in the DAO. So those are just my updates.
Great, yeah, thank you. Anyone, any questions for Amy? Okay, we'll move on then. There'll be time for questions at the end if anyone has anything specific. One, do you want to do a brief reminder for collateral calls and collateral calls?
Sure. More about collateral in general. We've been working, as was mentioned by I think Chris and Primoz, on a collateral framework to provide more transparency on which collateral types we are focusing on, why, and the priority in which they are tackled. So that's point number one. Point number two, yesterday we had a real world asset call with SEB Ventures. Matthew from 6S Capital was there. Lucas and Leah from Centrifuge as well. Priyanka from Open Law joined us too. So yeah, advancing on that front as well. Hopefully we can see a real progress soon. If you want to join, contact SEB Ventures on Rocket Chat. And regarding the next calls, next week we're going to have Brian from Cash Gold joining us, and Matt Luongo from Keep Network. That's going to be presenting TBTC. So that's October 7th at 5 p.m. UTC. We are thinking about doing an exceptional call the following week. So it would be like a double session, real world asset, and after or before. We still need to figure that out with Seb. We're going to have a REM BTC, and we are still trying to get Uniswap or Balancer. That hasn't been confirmed yet, but that will be October the 14th. And then on October the 21st, we're going to have Greg from Eurostasis and Crypto.com. Yeah, that's a little bit the point I wanted to talk about.
Great, yeah. Thank you for those updates. All right, I think that just leaves you, Charles. Do you want to do your MIPS updates?
Yeah.
Let me give you guys. There you go.
Okay. All right, so this week's activity, we had the monthly MIPS executive go live on Monday, and the bundled contents for this vote were 7 proposals. So 3 for collateral onboarding of comp, link, and LRC, and then 2 for domain team onboarding for the risk team, Primoz, and the smart contracts domain team, Chris Mooney, Brian Michael, Lucas Manuel, and Will Barnes. And lastly, there was a sub-proposal for a declaration of intent for the DAI Flash Mint module. And as a follow-up, Sam also created the technical MIP for that, which will go into a governance cycle depending on when he wants to formally submit it. So the monthly MIPS executive vote passed on Tuesday and was executed yesterday. So all of these proposals are now formally accepted. And today, Long technically already did it, but he will perform the governance cycle review where we can talk about everything that happened over the course of the cycle and also discuss any upcoming proposals that are looking to go into October cycle. So as I mentioned before, next week marks the beginning of October's governance cycle. On Monday, we have the formal submission period beginning from October to from October 5th to 7th. So this is when the MIPs or sub-proposals in the RFC phase are proposed to enter the governance cycle by the authors. So as a general reminder for all the MIPs or sub-proposal authors out there who have had their proposals in the RFC phase and have passed those feedback requirements, I encourage you to formally submit them to October cycle. Then next Thursday, we have the submission review. So Long for Wisdom will review the proposals that have been formally submitted and see which ones can be put forth into the inclusion pools on the following Monday. So these are all the current proposals that are in the RFC phase, and next to them bolded is when they are eligible to enter that governance cycle. So we have MIP 14, which is eligible for October. MIP 17 was reworked by Planet X. Maybe he will have the opportunity to mention what's changed on the call today. I've merged in his PR to the RFC branch, which is an iteration on the previous one that was rejected, and working off some of the issues as to why it was rejected. We have the MIP 20 Vox module by Lev that can go into October. And as mentioned before, the real world asset proposals for MIP 21 and 22 are also eligible for October. Lastly, we have the domain structure and roles proposed by Long for Wisdom that, as I spoke with him, he says that this will also probably be formally submitted to October. And a most recent one that was proposed, which is eligible for next month, is the emergency response by John Aikman. And as a sub-proposal update, the pairing ones for the real world asset proposals for the declarations of intent are also going to go into October if the authors do formally submit it. So the one, Matt Rabinowitz did formally submit his already, and then Lucas from Centrifuge can decide that soon. And the last one for that is going into October is the Strategic Funds Reserve Declaration of Intent by Seb Ventures. In terms of collateral onboarding, so we had Comp, Link, and LRC get added in September's governance cycle. The September collateral onboarding community greenlight polls, so 15 collateral types that are getting voted on right now, are still in progress and end on Monday, October 5th. So definitely go and vote if you haven't done so yet. And lastly, the collateral types that are in consideration for next cycle of collateral onboarding. Of course, this does depend on the change of the whole process, but the ones that are in consideration as of now are Wi-Fi, BAL, Uni, Rent BTC, Lend, PaxG, and GUSD, as Chris Mooney mentioned at the beginning of the call. I just wanted to recap the collateral onboarding improvements that was proposed last week. So the signal request that the mandate actors put forward to put these changes in place has passed. So a governance poll will be published for the MKR holders to confirm the change on Monday. And if passed, the new collateral onboarding process will be put in place effective immediately. And because I just wanted to go over what the changes were in case people weren't involved with the signal request and are curious to see how the collateral onboarding process is changing. The usage of MIPS 8, 10, 11, and 12 are going to be suspended temporarily, except for the part with MIP 10 that will still be used for whitelisting, light feeds, and Oracle's proposals. So this overall change allows the collateral onboarding to be more flexible on a weekly basis and that it can adjust to the demands of reality. And as the other domain team members have mentioned, there's going to be a public collateral onboarding prioritization framework, assessing all the greenlit assets with scores varying on their risks and benefits, and obviously resulting in the prioritization of specific assets based on those metrics. And of course, the foundation funded grants for collateral onboarding are also in place to allow the community to get more involved with the collateral onboarding process. And paired with that, there's going to be a knowledge transfer documentation resource for anyone interested in getting set up with a grant to work on things such as risk assessments, collateral adapters, and learning how to do these things. So that's it for today. If you have any questions, you can ask now quickly or just ping me on Rocket Chat.
All right. Thank you very much, Charles. So I'm supposed to do the governance cycle review. Planet, did you want to talk about your thing quickly?
Yes. MIP 17?
Yes.
Quickly. The present version of MIP 17 is a rework of the older MIP 17, and that didn't pass. And we had a meeting about why it didn't pass, and of course we don't know exactly why, but the older version tried to automate the setting of the debt ceilings and the rates, and that was possibly a bit too much. So the present version, it deals with the setting of the debt ceilings only. I will link in the chat. Here you are. So please read through and comment. It is not a very complicated MIP. All it does is to see if it introduces a new term called the target debt ceiling, and that is like a very high figure compared to the present debt ceiling. Just for the sake of the argument, just say double or even triple of the current debt ceiling. And this is typically a figure that will be set by the risk team. And as long as the outstanding debt is below this figure, we will let MIP 17 and the formulas in the MIP just handle the weekly setting of the debt ceiling. So as long as the debt ceiling or the utilization, as long as utilization is between 70 and 90%, nothing happens. If it rises above 90%, the next week there will be a 20% increase. If it falls below 70%, we deduct 20%. We aim with this formula, we aim to keep utilization pretty high. But that's enough for MIP 17. I think if interested people can have a look at it, and we have aimed to produce a simplified version of MIP 17. All right. Any questions you can write to me, or just comment in the forum. That was it for me.
All right. Thank you very much, Planet. All right. So I'm supposed to do the governance cycle review. So previous months, I've kind of looked at like how much Maker voted in the various parts of the process. But I'm not convinced anyone's super interested in that. So kind of going to skip that this time. I can bring it back if anyone cared. So I think we're just going to talk about like, Charles kind of already covered what we did last month. To kind of summarize, onboarded 3 assets. We onboarded some domain team members, which is awesome. And I think it was the declaration intent for the Flashment module passed, which was also very cool. So as for next month, I mean, Charles kind of covered this as well, but kind of hoping we'll see some of the MIPs that have been in RFC for a little while getting formally submitted. And I guess we'll see which ones those kind of actually are next Wednesday. Does anyone have any comments on the previous governance cycle or the next governance cycle? Is there anything that people are super happy with or super eager to see, I guess? Cool. Oh yeah, go. You had something. Okay. I mean, like from a personal point of view, like it's good to see the domain teams members kind of increasing, so that's great. It's good to see. It's good to see more assets being added. So those are kind of high points, I think. All right. So moving in, I guess, to the kind of second part of the call. We've got a couple of kind of segments to discuss various things. First up is a presentation on badges from, I believe, Aaron Anderson.
Yeah, that's me. Can I have permission to share screen?
You may.
Thank you, sir. Okay. So this morning, a post was set on the forum announcing maker badges are live. Some folks have already redeemed them, and now you can see next to their name are little icons representing the badges that they have. There are some bugs to work out, so if you run into something, please shoot an issue to the GitHub. An Aaron that isn't me used one of these as a title. So those are all cool things to do. To redeem them, I'll walk you through real quick. It's a real simple process. Once you're in the forum, click on your icon up here, go to Preferences. At the bottom of the Preferences screen, you'll see a button that says Import Maker Badges. If you click on it, if you're not already connected or signed in, you'll do that. And then you'll just sign a message that just says what your username is. So on the forum, I'm Web3 developer. So I sign that, send it to our Merkle service on the back end, and it will unlock badges. So I've got some badges now. And whenever you click on it, here you can see the steps. Like if you don't have a badge, you want to get it, you can walk through these steps to get it. You can see all the badges. Here, there's 33 of them. Of these 33, 25 can be post badges that show up next to your name. There are 8 that don't become post badges. That's only because I can only fit so many in here. And the ones that don't go in are the penultimate of any given series. So the second to last. We got 2 for sending die. If you send 10 die, it won't show up here. But if you send 20, that's the highest level badge for that series, it will show up. Same goes with voting on polls. I think if you vote on 10 polls, you'll get a badge here. 20 no, but 50 yes. Something along those lines. Additionally, so these right here, these badges are, you're just signing a message, so they cost no gas to redeem. There is a, the back end of this also has NFTs that are on chain that you will be able to redeem and use for other parts of DeFi. They're non-transferable NFTs. So they will stick with the account that redeems them. At this time, are there any questions?
Aaron, this is awesome. So it's just a signature that's the account is not tied to your forum account in any way, I assume?
Right, we don't store it. It goes through a Lambda function that just processes it and checks it against the Merkle tree. So there is a contract on chain that updates regularly with who's interacting with governance and maker contracts. And that's what we're checking against and getting a proof from, so that only the people that are entitled to a badge and can prove it by signing that signature can get it. But other than that, we don't save any of the information.
Can I link multiple accounts to my forum account?
Yeah, that was my next question.
Yep, sure can. In order to redeem multiple or badges for multiple accounts, just disconnect your account, click the redeem button again. I'll show an example. So in MetaMask, just hit the disconnect account button. And then the next time you go in, it will ask you to connect an account. And just select a different one.
That's awesome. Thanks.
Yes, sir.
Amazing work.
Thank you very much. Yeah, big shout out goes to Scotchpreneur and Nas for doing all the back end stuff, Josie for helping me out with the front, and several other developers for helping out with the front end.
Cool. Yeah, thank you for that, Darren. The badges look really nice. I'm looking forward to
Can I
seeing them.
It's like right now? Like, is this live?
Yeah,
It
it's
is.
live. We've had several people redeem already. And if you run into any issues, feel free to hit up the repo where this is hosted from and submit an issue. Today, I'll add a template for that so we can grab other pertinent debugging information like your account or transaction or those sorts of things.
Cool. Yeah, I'll run through this right now, see if I can give any feedback.
Thank you very much.
All right. Yeah. Thank you for that, Aaron. I kind of look forward to seeing those on the forum more. So that's gonna be awesome. All right. Unless anyone has any extra questions, let's maybe move on. Cool. All right. Sam / Hexanauts, did you want to kind of give us a brief kind of talk about like rate setting v2 a little bit and like the signal proposal that you've put on the forum?
Yep, I can do that. So I've just linked to it in the side. So basically, a few of us have been meeting over the past 2 weeks or so to try and like modernize the rate setting mechanism because it's been good for a while, but it's starting to show some strain under the new assets and new market conditions and all that kind of stuff. So some current issues that we're seeing with it. The smart contracts team has been having a hard time sort of following base rate changes and how these apply to the end stability fees. They kind of have to keep track of all this stuff. Another issue is governance really shouldn't be changing risk premiums directly or should stop calling it risk premiums. We find there's lots of, just tweaking or people at least saying they want to tweak risk premiums for reasons that aren't related to risk. So it's a little confusing. Another issue, base rate changes are affecting all assets instead of only a few that have a similar profile. Risk premiums should be ideally measured and reported continuously instead of just one time. And we may not necessarily want to have the risk premium be equal to the final markup used on top of the base rate. There's no mechanism for taking competition into account. And in particular, farming assets do not fit into our current rate setting paradigm at all. They really should be getting set on based on the yield they generate. So out of these meetings, we've come up with a proposal of how to change things. So what we're proposing is the formation of a new rates working group, which sits between risk, governance, and the smart contracts team. And then we grant more rate setting autonomy to this rates working group so they can be more flexible with how they update stability fees. We're going to add a market competition based rate setting methodology that initially the risk team will be handling. So this will be like, say so-and-so is charging 5% to borrow link on our competition, maybe we can undercut them a bit, but still we want the rates to stay as high as possible, but still undercutting our competition, that sort of thing. Another goal is to minimize governance overhead with the number of polls they have to vote on, continual transparency of how these rates are set. And this sort of marks a shift in how governance deals with rates. And we think it's more appropriate for governance to be setting higher level sort of plain English directives, such as set the stability fees on stablecoins to 0%, or even like we want to focus on growth over profit or something like that. having this sort of rigid formula is starting to become not tenable anymore. So that's sort of a high level summary of what we're proposing. I linked to the signal request, so please go and vote and comment on that. Thank you. Any questions? Nope. Okay. I guess that's it.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Sam. I would encourage everyone to kind of read over that proposal because, among other things, it's if it passes, it will we'll no longer be voting weekly on the base rate, which some of you may have opinions about strongly one way or the other. So I would encourage everyone to kind of read over that proposal completely and kind of understand what the changes will look like, I guess, and provide feedback, obviously, if you feel that it's the right move or the wrong move. All right, thank you for that, Sam. All right, Vishesh, do you want to give us a state of the peg for the week?
Sure. I'll try and spare you from too much length since we're at over the hour.
Yeah.
Cool. All right.
86%.
Sorry.
Come on. 86. 86. Oh, 27.
Yeah. All right. So just to kind of recap where we're at a high level. So roughly 900 million DAI minted, which that feels good to say. That's quite a bit. What we have is still about 350 million from ETH. We're up a little bit to about 4 million from BAT. We're looking at a solid 360 some million from USDCA, 84 million from WBTC, a few thousand from USDCB, about 50 million from TUSD, and then smaller amounts from KNC, ZRX, and Mana, 30 mil from PAX, and then again smaller amounts from USDTA, Comp, LRC, and Link. So what we're primarily looking at is the current DAI supply being primarily comprised of PAX, TUSD, WBTC, USDCA, BAT, and ETH. What that also means is there's ETH is now outnumbered by stablecoins. So that's just something to be aware of. In terms of where DAI has been trading and performing from a peg standpoint, so things have been pretty stable. I mean, I think that's the kind of theme of the week is things were pretty quiet. So what we saw was a lot of smaller trades. We saw the price basically holding and hovering above and below $1.01, pretty much smack dab on the dot. The ETH price was kind of holding steady / rising a bit. So that's kind of the backdrop of what we were looking at least as of yesterday. So the trading volumes have been a bit lighter than the past couple of weeks, and we still see a huge chunk of that being Uniswap trades for the DAI ETH pair. When we look at USDT, we saw a huge amount of that being Swerve and Curve, and what we saw in the last week was mainly Curve, and again, pretty much smack dab on $1 with some of that variance in price decreasing, which tends to happen when we start to look at smaller trades because it's those larger trades that tend to push liquidity upwards or downwards, resulting in more or less slippage. So you can sort of see some of that noise kind of decrease there over the last couple of days. For USDC, we see, again, Curve dominating that volume. There was, a couple of weeks ago, more volume on Swerve. And then again, same story of around $1.01 with decreased variation in some of those trade prices. DAI USD pair, again, it tends to have a bit more noise naturally, but again, sitting more or less around $1.01. So not much had changed in terms of the DAI supplies, other than the growing share of stablecoin minted DAI. But we did see, some movement over the past week in some of the system parameters, introductions of new collateral types recently, etc. So these system parameter changes don't appear to have had a huge impact on the DAI supplies in and of themselves, with the exception of obviously movements of debt ceilings. So we're looking at a overall debt ceiling about 1.4 mil, 1.4 bill right now, sorry. And we've seen basically growing utilization of these debt ceilings as the goalposts get moved. So, for example, we saw the PAX utilization hit around 30 mil. Now that we've got a 60 mil debt ceiling, it will be interesting to watch whether this will see increased utilization and shoot up closer to the limit again. But overall, what we're looking at is the top few places where that DAI ends up right now. So we got Uniswap, Curve, SushiSwap, Wirearn, Aave are some of these largest pools of DAI. I'll touch on, there's one other one obviously, but basically we look at like 230 million DAI just from the top two out of 900 million minted is a pretty significant share. So that's kind of the same old story as of the past couple months, with pools, liquidity pools and farming opportunities dominating that DAI supply. The other obvious mention is Compound, where you have roughly 200 million excess supply sitting, the same as has been for quite a while. And obviously a lot of metrics take that out of the circulating supply because it basically ends up in the DSR anyway. So that's the other large chunk of where that DAI ends up. If we look at ETH, so again, some of these stable coins, it's going to be an interesting conversation around collateralization ratios. And there have been a lot of threads around what those system parameters should be and how liquidations work, etc., and the potential for triggering liquidations via simply accrual of stability fees. And that's sort of a separate thread, but in terms of market risk triggering liquidations, in terms of large pools of assets, ETH is the obvious biggest notable mention. And the market risk there right now is, if you look at an ETH price of about 280, that would be 84 million DAI liquidated. This is not quite as bad of a liquidation wall if we've seen, say, 2 weeks ago. So what we're kind of looking at here is a decent chunk of that DAI ETH supply sitting at 200 to 300% collateralized, where we were seeing a more troublesome chunk at 150 to 200% prior, though there is still a pretty significant amount of DAI ETH that is sitting less than 200% collateralized. If we look at those largest few vaults, we're looking at collateralization ratios of 240, 290, 211, 196, 222, 196. So there are a few large positions that are at like 196, 195, and those are probably the biggest market risk positions to watch. But that is, seemingly less risky than some of what we were looking at, say, a week ago. So that's a potential positive, though that's very, very likely just due to movements in ETH price. And that's always something to take into account versus manual or managed movements in the amount of collateral that's backing these debt positions. Yeah, all right. So I will pause there and double click on anything that people want to focus on further. All right.
Right. Yeah, thanks
I
for that.
will pass it
Josh.
back. Yeah.
Yep, no worries. Cool. All right. We maybe got sort of 5-10 minutes for kind of QA and kind of discussion if anybody has any questions about any of the topics today or wants to start a discussion. Yeah, feel free. Okay, doesn't seem like there's anyone desperate to speak. Yeah, I think maybe sort of kind of 5-10 minutes is not really time for a
Hey, I actually had a
okay, yeah, go.
a couple of so mana is the first thing. I've been looking at and again, these are my personal opinion, but Uniswap and Bouncer have very low liquidity for that collateral.
Sorry, for which?
So I think the risk team or the community should really kind of take a look at that. Like if that were to go to the liquidations, I don't know necessarily what kind of good prices they would be getting.
Sorry, I missed which collateral type you're talking about. Could you repeat it?
Mana, M-A-N-A.
Yeah, gotcha. Cool.
So I'm hoping the community can take a look at that. The other issue, hang on one second, sorry.
All right.
Sorry, I've been having some mic problems. Can you guys hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So sorry, the other issue was taking a look at the USDCA vaults, and I'm hoping the risk team or Vishesh or anybody could kind of understand those vaults and if liquidations were to be turned on and DAI is trading at 101, what are the implications or what's the potential shortfall of payments necessarily to the Maker protocol? So again, it's hard to grab this data, and so I'm hoping, so that kind of brings up another point, which is I would like the system to be a little bit more transparent, where anybody could look at all the vaults and in a very transparent way understand what are the collateralization ratios. So like right now, it takes a little bit of expertise, I think, to kind of go through the blockchain. But in like Psi or the original DAI version, there was mcare.tools. It was much easier for literally anybody to grab that data and analyze it in Excel. And so I think better tooling is needed for the entire community.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. There's some tooling needed, but you can actually get those data points, I believe, from Vishesh's website. So if you're interested in collateralization ratios for USDC, I think you can get them there. But all in all, what's the strategy with USDC? We discussed it a bit. So currently, if you could look at the collateralization ratios for USDCA, I believe the lowest one is 100.8 something. So ideally, when you ask about liquidation, turning liquidations on, you would be doing this, of course, manually with, with some strategy in place, and you would be doing this when the DAI price is, much lower than now. But in that case, those vaults would unwind anyway, right? So what we need to discuss here is what's the timeline, right? When do we want to see turning off those stability fees, so we don't cause that, we're creating a virtual, we're collecting virtual fees, but we know we're not be able to collect them. And we have about 3 months of time. One of my idea was that we could shut down fees at about 100.5 collateralization ratio, when most of vaults are there, because this still creates some incentive for vault users to, actually come back and unwind those loans if DAI price is, of course, below 1.005, right? So they still have some capital in the over collateralization part. So that's one potential idea. But otherwise than that, yeah, basically we're not really, we can control most of it in 3 months time. So I'm not really worried about it. And as I said, you can see those vaults winding down every time the price of DAI goes below 1.01. There's a natural incentive for those vaults to unwind. So you're seeing some of that, although the recent unwinding that we saw in recent days, I think it was about 35 million decrease in USDCA. Part of that is also related purely to USDC vaults farming DAI somewhere. And now the DAI, basically the stablecoin rates, farming rates fell a bit. And you're seeing people that farm DAI with USDC vaults, they're basically, unwinding them, some of them, because they just want to get USDC back, right?
Yeah, so about that, right? Right, you suggested that, right, once we hit a certain average collateralization ratio, right, then we turn off the stability fees. What's the argument against the alternative where you just keep the stability fees on? And doesn't it just come out as a wash anyway, right? Because the system thinks it's collecting fees, right, additional fees, right? But it's not, because if those vaults were ever to get liquidated, right, all those fees would just be a loss anyway. But at least people opening new positions, right, would be paying net positive stability fees, versus in your scenario, right, even new people that are coming to open a position, right, they're not going to be paying any fees. So can you explain that a little bit more? Because I'm sure you have a great reason for that. So
yeah, why not just manually liquidate them, and why instead rely on them unwinding themselves? Why is that better? I guess when there's a clear incentive for vaults to unwind, you're sure that you're collecting your fees. Whereas if you do manual liquidation, there are some unknowns there, right? They're going to be auctions, and keepers bid as much as they bid, right? And there might be some slippage applied. So you never know what's the loss really there. Whereas if you shut down fees and you hope that those vaults return and unwind, you exactly know that you're going to collect all the DAI and all the fees, if that happens, of course. That's why I still prefer market-wise unwinding.
But wouldn't that also create a situation where if you're collecting fees, once it gets over the threshold, we'll also be burning a bunch of maker on fees that actually are somewhat fictitious, right? And in the reverse, if we have to have an unwind of it, you're basically ultimately diluting maker by the same amount. By turning it off, you'd impede both steps, no?
Well, yes, but what you can do is just increase the buffer of the size of the surplus buffer, right? And then you never go through the whole MKR dilution and burning and then dilution again, right? Because before it prints MKR, it dilutes MKR, it grabs it from the stability fee, the surplus buffer first as a primary, right? So really it's just accounting in my mind. There's no real kind of how much slippage do we have when we burn, and then how much slippage do we have when we dilute. There wouldn't ever be a burn and a dilution if we set the parameters correctly.
Yeah, if I can jump in really quickly, like, yes, it's certainly preferable if you're going this leave fees on route to, you know, just collect surplus buffer and keep enough in it to cover all those fees, so you don't have to have that, the, you know, the inefficiencies that would come from first burning MKR and then, you know, reminting it. So it's definitely better to keep the buffer. But the finer point I wanted to make is that there are always going to be inefficiencies in the liquidation process. So one place this comes from is the minimum bid increase parameter, which is percentage, currently set at 3% for all collaterals. So like, even if you have a 100% collateralization ratio vault, if you theoretically sent that to auction, you'd probably only get back 98 DAI on it. And so you're looking at sort of a high probability of losses and inefficiencies with liquidations, even if everything goes correctly.
I mean, for stablecoins, we would almost 100% lower that threshold, right?
Well,
because
it's set at 3% right now.
well, yeah, but we don't have the liquidations turned on for stablecoins. If we were to turn them on, then presumably we would lower that parameter to something like 1%, maybe even 0.5%, but definitely 1% at least, because otherwise we're just taking on a stupid amount of losses, right? But I think the missing thing here is the fact of like liquidations 2.0, right? That's really what's going to help us in this scenario, right? Because they have instant settlement in a single transaction, right? Which means people can use flash loans, right? So the capital requirements go way down, and people can directly arb against things like Curve and Uniswap, right? So having an auction keeper, not have to put up capital, right, and can just immediately, trade against Curve, right? You're going to get a much more competitive price just because the amount of liquidity that there's on Curve.
Yeah, you can certainly minimize the risks involved with liquidations as the liquidation system either you change parameters or launch improvements to it. The question is, I guess, just how much more risk or disruption is there with doing a liquidation versus getting these things to unwind naturally?
Cool. So I think Brian made quite a good point in the sidebar, saying that if DAI is below peg at the time liquidations happen, then in theory you have the potential to gain through that as well if DAI is below $1 when at liquidation time.
Yeah. And if DAI is above $1, you have the opposite.
Yeah, for sure.
That you'll get even less DAI than you expect.
Yeah, but if DAI is below peg, those vaults will unwind themselves, right? You wouldn't even be relying on liquidations unless vaults are clearly abandoned and people. But that's the idea about self-unwinding, right? If there's still some over collateral inside, the DAI is below, they're gonna bind themselves. You wouldn't even need to liquidate them.
Well, if at 101%, I mean, there were plenty of opportunities to just take a flash loan and take the arb and walk away from the vault entirely. So we can't count on the original vault holder to unwind their own vault, because they may not even have access to it, depending on how they coded it up.
True.
All right. Okay, I think we'll probably leave it there for today. It would maybe be good to kind of start a thread about the various kind of actual options for winding down the stability fee stuff, because it's kind of been discussed in the calls a couple of times. It's been discussed in the chat, but I don't think there's been a forum post that kind of summarizes the various options. But yeah, we're stretching half past, so I think we'll leave it there for today. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming. And yeah, I'll see all of you next week, I think. Thanks, guys.
Thanks.